set of numbers, I think. Of course, people can say productivity is a terribly abstract phenomenon. Nobody's really very interested. It doesn't really kind of hit home in people's lives. What hit homes in people's lives, of course, are wage levels. And this plot here it's actually out of the Treasury Plan for Growth document in March 2021 makes this point beautifully. This productivity slowdown has been absolutely mirrored by a decade of wage stagnation. So people may not follow the quarterly productivity figures with as much assiduousness as I do, but I think people probably do notice that, you know, that then they're not as well off this idea that we're going to, you know, that we'll constantly get a bit better off every year. That's just stopped. Then how does this let's introduce some geography into this, a bit of regional geography. And as I think is now well known, the UK is two countries. The UK has a prosperous greater southeast. So if we look at southeast, London, quite a lot of East Anglia, no, in fact all of East Anglia, but quite a lot of East Anglia. This looks like a Northern European economy, successful Northern European economy with a productivity that's comparable to successful parts of Northern Europe. But as we go out into the Midlands, into the north, Wales and the northeast, Northern Ireland, you have levels of productivity that are comparable much more with southern Italy, with Portugal, with parts of Spain, and as Elvira told me, not the Basque Country, which has been airbrushed out of this plot, and would actually look much more successful than its neighbouring regions. So this is, you know, the first dimension of our problem is that productivity growth itself has stagnated, it's stopped, and that's reflected in things like living standards. It's also reflected in the fiscal position of the government. The second dimension is that these regional inequalities in productivity persist. One way in which this shows up, which I think is rather interesting, I mean, in a way, the differences in productivity in the UK are actually much greater than I think are noticeable in people's everyday lives, because in a sense, the UK runs a transfer union. So money is generated in the east, in the southeast, and in London, and that money generated there then is moved up into the Midlands and the north to kind of to run the state and to run public services. So this plot shows here current budget balance, you know, on the government account of different regions. So that's the difference between government revenue and current expenditure. I'm excluding capital here. And so you can see on current spending, London is generating you know, more than £4,000 per person, which has then been kind of shoveled to the rest of the country. And of course, the reason that happens is because GVA per person is extremely unbalanced. So when it comes to, I think this is an important political point. When it comes to levelling up, you know, we're starting to hear tensions in the levelling up debate, with people thinking, well, this is all about, you know, taking money away from London and giving it to the north. Well, no, at the moment we take away money from London and give it to the north, but we do that on the current account. And the interesting point, and you know, Neil O'Brien, now the junior levelling up minister, you know, made this very compellingly. We seem happy to move the money on the revenue side to the north, but we don't move money. The investments that we could make that would be productivity enhancing are concentrated in London and the southeast. So the way I would want to frame the levelling up argument is that we need to make the productivity enhancing investments in the other parts of the country that will move their GVA per person up. So it will benefit people, but it will also put their current budget balance position into a better state. So in that view, levelling up really is about how can we help London to keep more of its own money. So one of the productivity enhancing types of productivity enhancing investments is the money that we spend on R&D. So this brings me to my next plot. So we hear at the moment government's aspiration to make the UK a science superpower, and to be fair, they do quite often say this is an aspiration. They want to restore the UK's position as a science superpower. And what this plot shows is actually, you probably could argue that in 1980 the UK was a science superpower. Certainly in terms of the proportion of its economy that it devoted to R&D, both public and private, that was amongst the highest in the world. So you see there's quite a lot of convergence at the left-hand side of this graph. So these countries, Germany, United States, France, all spending more or less the same. What you see as over the 40 years that's happened since then, you seem to, and we can divide this up into two bits really. We've seen what we might think of as conventional comparator countries, the USA, France, and Germany, they've seen slow increases in the proportion of their economy that they devote to R&D. We've seen East Asian countries, particularly Korea. We've seen a remarkable rise of Korea as Korea has moved its economy into being a very high technology economy. It supported that with this actually very high, nearly 5% of GDP to being devoted to R&D, and then we've seen that mirrored on a much larger scale. Of course, it's a larger country than China, so China's R&D intensity has gone up from a rather low value. And then superimposed on that, what you see from the UK is this fall. So in fact, you saw a gradual fall through the 1980s and early 90s, quite an abrupt fall in the late 90s, and then it's kind of trotted along at about 1.7% ever since. And so, one of the kind of interesting dates in here is that about 2009, the R&D intensity of China surpassed the R&D intensity of the UK. So the question is a little bit, what is the significance of that? Of course, I mean, when one talks, there's another way of looking at these numbers. I plotted this with R&D as a fraction of GDP. Of course, another way of asking, are we a science superpower, is say, what are the absolute numbers? And of course, the absolute numbers, because the UK's GDP is smaller than that of the USA or indeed Germany. In absolute terms, what is the fraction of the scientific output of the world that the UK does? It's really rather small. Well, does that matter? Why do we think R&D matters? And here, I think and I have to kind of confess my, my deafness. As a kind of, as an experimental scientist, I am kind of brought up to think, well, it's just obvious that R&D is terribly important and you can't have a modern economy without it. In fact, when one actually looks at the evidence for this, it's actually quite hard and quite tricky. There's some econometric evidence. I think this paper from Jonathan Haskell and co-workers is one of the kind of one of the better ones. It does show that on the basis of econometrics that there are fairly substantial spillovers from public and private R&D, as you'd expect from economic theory. And there's an estimated rate of return on public R&D, which is about 20% per annum, which seems quite a lot. And there are some other insights that come from here. Those spillovers from public R&D of the private sector depend on the capacity of industry to absorb it. And there's some kind of numerical experiments that we do on the basis of this data, which allow you to estimate. There is a demonstrable connection between total factor productivity growth in the private sector and public R&D. But I think there are lots of outstanding issues here. I mean, these are very highly coarse-grained results. They're coarse-grained with respect both to industry sector and geography. And it's easy to see why spillovers might happen, but the question is, what's the geographical range of those spillovers? And there's some evidence. Again, the evidence for this is not as good as I would like, but the evidence is that differing by industries, this can be regional rather than national. And this brings me on to this. Let me just kind of pose this as a paradox, as a kind of geographical paradox of research and development. The paradox is this: science is a global enterprise, and its results are available to everyone. It's an increasingly open enterprise, and if it wasn't for Elsevier, it would be even more open. So there's no way in which the results of basic science in principle ought to be open to anyone, anywhere to exploit. And likewise, the products of technology are mostly freely traded across the world. We've seen great pieces of science happening in the development of vaccines, both the Oxford vaccine, the great developments of the BioNTech vaccine, the Moderna vaccines. They're fantastic technological and scientific achievements, and modulo a little bit of how fast one can scale up the manufacturing. The benefits of those are seen throughout the world. And yet, not all nations are equally technologically advanced. I mean, to state the obvious, they aren't. And this paradox, I think we could resolve by thinking a little harder about, what actually is the role of research and development in a modern economy. And I think it's clear it's because it's not just about, or maybe even not mostly about the knowledge it generates and the inventions it produces, but it is about the capacity to absorb technology. And I think, we have everyone comes with their own perspective to this. I think a problem of both politicians and scientists, that their perspective, I've learned my trade in a set of very academic laboratories, and politicians enjoy going to the Crick Institute and seeing white-coated scientists in marvelous palaces. But I'm not sure perhaps if they spent more time going to see the efforts of a research engineer and an engineering company in Rochdale, or a chemical company in Gateshead, let's have a different view about this and understand that research and development, when it comes to it, is simply a formalized way. It's just assigning a bit of manpower to thinking systematically about how to innovate. And so that if we understood it in those terms, we'd be less surprised by this. But having said that, why is the nation state the right unit of analysis? In the sense, I've assumed that the nation state is the right unit of analysis. I've shown you a plot that shows R&D intensity by country, making no justification about why geographically the nation state is the right unit to proceed. And there are kind of two reasons why you might think this is a bad idea. One is actually, obviously, firms are enormously important. So, if you go 20 miles east of Dublin, there's a pretty high technology plant that makes semiconductor CPUs, probably the most advanced semiconductor fab in Europe. How did that happen? It wasn't because the Irish suddenly developed a lot of science. It's because Intel moved there, bringing their expertise and their knowledge, and in that way, they established a very high technology and industry in the Republic. So in a sense, that's one dimension. So Intel is a global corporation. If it builds a fab in the Republic of Ireland, if it builds a fab in Southeast Asia, in a sense, it's bringing together that same kind of collective product of lots and lots of R&D. Intel is an astonishingly R&D intensive company, and the results of that R&D is then dotted around the world according to where it makes its investments. But then there's a smaller dimension that if we think about, there's a very classic economic theory about clusters, about the development of clusters, and that having just been to Oldham, it's it first of all had a lot of knowledge about how to spin cotton, and it developed quite a lot of knowledge about how to make quite sophisticated electronics. And that tacit knowledge, those clusters, are anchored by a kind of a tacit knowledge which goes around in people's heads. So on that argument, then the right geographical unit of analysis is probably more related to things like what's the travel to work area, what's the kind of the scale of a local labour market where people could move jobs without too much disruption to their personal lives. So those are two different reasons why one can argue that the nation state isn't really the right unit of analysis to think about this. So that brings me on to what about R&D on a regional basis. If we now zoom in on having argued that the UK has gone from this very research-intensive state to this rather lagging state at taking the analysis at the nation-state level, we now zoom in and look at where's R&D done in the UK on a finer grained geographical map. Here's what we see. This bit of the talk owes a huge amount to a report I did for Nesta, which was published in May 2020, and it was written with Tom Forth, who's a data scientist based in Leeds now. And so this report is available there. And so here's a plot of how this works. R&D spending in the UK is extremely highly concentrated. It's concentrated in London, the East, and the South East. So this plot shows at NUTS 2 level, apart from London, lumped in as NUTS 1, both public and private R&D. What I want to point out about this is a couple of things. First of all, it's rather interesting that public sector funding is more concentrated than private sector funding. The kind of headline, though, is that if we take London and the two sub-regions that contain Oxford and Cambridge, between them, they account for 46% of all public and charitable spending on R&D. So our map of R&D in the UK is enormously highly concentrated. And as I say, weirdly, it's more highly concentrated in the public sector than the private sector. Just because for those of us in the north, I just want to point out where some of these things are. Cheshire is actually the highest R&D intensive part of the north, almost all driven by the private sector. So that's all about specialty chemicals and materials, those pharmaceuticals, biotech in Cheshire. Merseyside is quite close to GM. Merseyside and GM look quite similar. Both got a roughly 50-50 split between public and private sector. They're kind of, mid-table performers. West Yorkshire a bit lower than GM, but same sort of pattern. Then we've got the northeast, even lower. Lancashire again is actually quite private sector dominated, so little public sector, quite a lot of private sector. Teesside, not very much now. We're getting really down into the tail. East Yorkshire, not very much. Cumbria, not very much either. So what can one say about that? The obvious correlation is that the poorer, less productive parts of the UK do less R&D. So this just shows you that simple correlation. And I would stress I'm not at all sure which direction the causality goes in this, if any, but it reinforces a point I made earlier, which is that we currently, the way that we invest R&D is that the places that are already less productive do less R&D. So leveling up. If we wanted to level up public R&D spending, what would we do? So here's the plot. I've kind of gone to an even coarser geography than the regions. So if we just divide up the country into these 5 regions and one that's missing that I'll come to in a minute, what do you get? Well, you see that in London, the southeast, and the east, the state spends about £220 per person on R&D. And I would emphasise this is the public R&D. And you can see that's pretty much double what's spent everywhere else. So if we wanted to just level up on the basis of saying we want to get roughly similar spending per person on average, averaged over the whole of the north of England, the whole of the Midlands, the whole of South Wales, Wales and Northern Ireland, I've lumped together. I'm sure I said unpopular. What would you get? So there you are. I've leveled up. There we are. How much money would I need to do to level up? Well, here's what I'd need to do. I'd need to spend about £1.6 billion per annum more in the north. And because we're in Greater Manchester, the equivalent figure for Greater Manchester is 250 million. I need to spend 1.4 billion in the Midlands, 570 million in the Southwest, 660 million in Wales and Northern Ireland. So that comes to 4.2 billion. That's why our report was called The Missing 4 Billion. I thought it was a gimmick, but the Nesta people really liked that as a title, so they made us do it, and it has had some impact, so they were right. And I want to just comment, 4.2 billion sounds like quite a lot of money, and it sort of is quite a lot of money, but it's not a ridiculous amount of money. And there's just a few sums I'd want to compare it with. One is, the UKRI budget is roughly 7 or 8 billion a year. So that's the major government funding agency. Total UK government investment on R&D at the moment is 14.9 billion in this current financial year. There's been a promise that R&D spending will be increased to 22 billion per year. And in the March 2020 budget, that was given a timeline of 2025. The Prime Minister has recently kind of reinforced this and said, yeah, 22 billion, we're going to get to 22 billion, but the date has mysteriously disappeared. But we can come to that later. So 4.2 billion, it's a lot of, it's not a trivial amount of money in the context of the overall research budget, but it's actually not a stupid amount of money in the context of what the government say they want to do. The other number I want to mention is 323 million. That's actually, when Tom and I go and talk about this, quite often the reaction that we get is, well, we've known about this for a long time, everybody's known, and we've tried to do it. We've tried, we've had all these initiatives to try and rebalance R&D expenditure. Nothing's ever worked, so we should just stop. And one of the kind of most prominent ways of previous attempts was the English RDAs. So RDAs were set up in England in the 2000s. They were given quite a lot of discretion about what to spend their money on. Many of them, I think, quite sensibly chose innovation as one of the things to spend it on. And in fact, the total amount that they spent over those 3 years, 2005 to 2008, was 323 million. So, roughly 100 million a year. So Tom and I's response to those people who say, well, we tried and it didn't work, was, well, we didn't try hard enough. These sums are just not at the right scale. It's, an order of magnitude or too small to expect to make a difference. So we didn't try hard enough, and that's why we failed. So what should we do? One of the ways of thinking about this that actually Tom first introduced, and I give him the credit for this, because I think it's a really powerful way of thinking about how countries, and the report actually does this analysis of quite a few different countries, and it's actually, I think, very revealing. One of the ways to think about this is to see how the government R&D and the public, so public R&D and private sector R&D split out. So roughly speaking, in economies like the UK, the same applies in France and Germany. The rough rule of thumb is if the government puts in £1 of R&D, the private sector responds by putting in £2 of R&D. So there's 1 to 2 ratio. And as I say, it doesn't hold for East Asian economies, interestingly. So there's something different about East Asian economies that allow them to get much more private sector R&D for a given input of public sector R&D. But across kind of European and American economies, that 2-to-1 rule holds quite well. And so you see the USA. The USA puts in a lot more public money into its R&D, and the private sector in the USA responds in that 2-to-1 fashion. So the straight line there is the 2-to-1 ratio. So what we can do is we can roughly split this into 4 different regions. So we've got up in the East England and Southeast England are places where the public sector puts a lot of money into R&D and the private sector responds. In these cases of East England responds kind of disproportionately. So in those are places that I think we would say these are the knowledge-intensive economies that we would want to emulate. And again, to come back to the politics of this and the politics of levelling up, I think it's very important, I think, that we should always stress that, I think Cambridge is a great place. I lived there for 15 years, quite like the place, but it's a great place for the economy too. It's kind of, it is a place which produces, it's very effective at turning public investment into even more private investment, and then turning that into new products and processes that lead to GVA. So East England and Southeast England are places that you want to emulate, and it's not a coincidence, I think, that those are the places that look most like successful Northern European regions. And if we did this plot, we'd see them stacking up comparably with the more successful bits in Northern Europe. So I didn't mention Scotland in my levelling up thing. The reason why I didn't do that is that Scotland actually gets pretty much the same amount of public money invested into R&D as the Greater South East. But what you see is it has much lower level of business R&D. Likewise, London actually gets even more public money that has the highest level of public R&D spending actually takes place in London. And again, the response there is there's not actually that much business R&D following. There's much less. So our argument there is that, well, these are places where if you think the purpose, I mean, you're welcome to think the purpose of public R&D, it has other purposes. But if you think that the purpose of public R&D is to persuade the private sector to invest, and then that to then turn into growth and jobs, then it doesn't seem to us that these places are doing that well. So I think here, I mean, to be fair, I think the Scottish government actually appreciates this quite well, and I think the Scottish government are producing some quite sensible policies to try and, with the aim of explicitly driving up business R&D. The top left, though, is a kind of really quite interesting place. You've got the Midlands, the Northwest, Southwest. Southwest, of course, is actually a rather a funny region, because the Southwest, I mean, one struggles with the coarseness of this geography, and the Southwest contains, the region around Bristol, which looks much like the Southeast, and rather high R&D intensity, and it contains Cornwall, which is very, very low R&D intensity. So the blobbers from the Southwest is, I should just remember that's a reminder of the limitations of this coarse geography. But for the West Midlands, the East Midlands, and the Northwest, what we actually have is business R&D relatively high compared to public sector R&D. And here, our argument here would be, here's a rather a strong case for further public investment, because in a sense that the market is giving us signals about what kind of R&D would be required. It's not like there's nothing there. We know what sectors there are strong and innovative and spending their money on R&D, and but there are probably spillovers that are going not captured because that's not being supported by private sector, public sector investment. And then finally, we've got on the bottom left-hand corner, we've got Northern Ireland, Wales, North East, Yorkshire, and Humber, where actually both of these things are pretty low. There's rather low public R&D, low business R&D. And here I think things are more difficult in terms of what you should do. It's about building up capacity from that lower base. I should say, Northern Ireland actually is an interesting case because I think Northern Ireland actually has been very successful in recent years in increasing business R&D without actually a lot of input from the public sector. So Northern Ireland is getting to the point of being promoted into the top left quadrant. So that's the way of thinking about it. I just want to talk a little bit about who does R&D in the UK. So what this plot here does is it shows R&D spending as a percentage of national GDP split out by sectors of performance. So who's doing it? Business, higher education, government, and charity. And the first thing to notice is, yet again, the UK is not really in the ranks of science superpowers. It's between the Czech Republic and Italy at the moment. But what's interesting is that if we look at the university bit, the UK, Germany, and the USA actually do quite similar amounts of R&D in their university sector. But Germany and the USA do a lot more R&D in government-owned applied research centres. And the corresponding business R&D intensity in Germany and the USA is much higher than the UK. So I think that's an interesting feature of the UK's public sector R&D landscape. But the government has a target of getting public and private R&D to 2.4%. That's really quite a stretching target. So the date for that was 2027. So that's a very stretching target that demands changes in behaviour by the private sector as well as public sector investments. Having said that, 2.4% is still actually is still less than the 2.4% target originated because it was the OECD average at when people were thinking about that. The OECD average has actually gone up since then. 2.4% target still only gets you to Belgium. I want to say something about R&D. I've focused entirely on R&D, and many people will say quite correctly that there is more to innovation than R&D. So there are other things that there's organisational changes. There's different innovation in business models, which many people in this room will be very aware of. There'll be innovation in design and marketing. And all those things are important, but I do want to just insist that R&D is still pretty important. So here's the UK's innovation survey. If we look at the percentage of total innovation expenditure, that combination of internal R&D and external R&D still adds up to being the largest component of firms' innovation activities. I want to this is a slight aside, but this is the problem of the target is how do we persuade businesses to spend more money on R&D? Well, one way that the government has decided is an effective way of persuading companies to spend more on R&D is to give them the money in the form of a subsidy, the R&D tax credit. And I think it's a really little understood aspect of innovation policy in the UK. It's how much this, first of all, how much these subsidies are worth and how much they've changed. So what you see here is the R&D, the blue line, the light blue line shows you, the value of that R&D tax credit subsidy. As you see, it's gone up from this shows you the R&D expenditure that's used to claim those tax credits. And this is a slightly nerdish point about how you measure R&D. In the UK, there's kind of two ways of measuring R&D at the moment. There's a survey where companies are selected and asked how much R&D you do, and there's the amount of money they claim against these R&D tax credits. And you can see there's been this really big divergence between what they report in the survey and what they claim. And the importance of this is because actually This is worth about £7 or £8 billion a year. So the R&D tax credit, the cost of the R&D tax credit is actually on the same order of magnitude as direct investment by the government in R&D. And it's rather interesting, and this plot comes from a paper by David Connell, who's a judge in Cambridge, who his paper, "Is the UK's flagship industrial policy a costly failure?" I think he expects the answer to that to be yes. So this is a slightly controversial point, and it's not one that the Treasury is particularly receptive to, but there is an issue there. And I also need to mention, because one of the great things about the Productivity Institute is that I've got to meet people from different disciplines, including actual proper macroeconomists. And there is a view that says, we've had a decade where the economy has been run cold, that there's been, kind of fairly consistent low level of demand. And, there's a macroeconomic argument that says, well, the amount of money that companies will invest in the future depends on demand. And there is this really striking figure which I've taken from the innovation survey, showing this rather dramatic drop in the number of companies that even think it's worth trying to innovate, down from 53% in 12 to 14, down to 37% in 16 to 18. So that's another issue that I don't fully understand. I want to say something about institutions. We live in a university. This is our, those of us who live in universities. University is the classic R&D institution, and indeed, I've shown in terms of public R&D in the UK, that is in fact true. Most public R&D in the UK gets, or a disproportionate amount gets done in universities. Universities, of course, have multiple missions. They're focused on discovery research and a set of incentives that comes from the editors of our famous journals and the careful peer reviewers of our ref papers. They do training and skills, they do industry engagement, and that's important. They do commercialization, they do a bunch of stuff. And they have impact from regional to international. We've seen new institutions being seen. So the Francis Crick Institute is fundamentally a discovery research institute, very focused on high science, aims at international impact, and it may do some commercializable IP, but that would be a byproduct. I just want to kind of highlight a kind of missing middle here, or not even a missing middle, a kind of institution that we've been quite bad at in the UK. The example I really like is the Industrial Technology Research Institute. This is fundamentally a translational research institute focused on industry engagement, focused much more on process innovation than kind of producing new IP and new products. Also very much involved in skills development and the idea of recreating an ecosystem. And a great example of what ITRI did, ITRI had produced one of the world's most valuable and important spin-outs in the Taiwan Center for Manufacturing. And that's rather significant. The way that happened was, they didn't discover some marvelous new process for making semiconductors from scratch. They actually licensed the technology from RCA and they just developed it. They just worked out how to make it better. They just focused on the process innovation. Everything, it's a very secretive company. Nobody really knows quite what they do. It doesn't protect its IP, but it's all about know-how. I think that's something that we've not done enough of in the UK. And, we've had reasonably is a very impressive industry cluster, and it's very important. So this gives us the idea that you should rebuild these in. Sorry. An idea that I think is again very important comes from Pisano and Shi in this paper from 2009, this idea of the industrial commons. That if you've got a regional cluster, you've got a whole bunch of collective resources and knowledge. You've got, and it's this collective knowledge that drives innovations in both products and processes. And I think this is, ITRI is a great example about how you created an industrial commons. So if you need large anchor companies and institutions, you need networks of supplying companies, you need R&D facilities. I think they're important anchors. and this produces these informal knowledge networks, informal institutions for training and skills. So I think regional economic policy really should consciously attempt to rebuild these industrial commons. So gets me to the end of this section about R&D imbalances, and I'm just going to say what we thought so this is what we thought the government ought to do. We'll come on next to what they actually have done. We do think that you need to have devolution of substantial R&D funding. We think those imbalances in R&D are connected to imbalances in productivity, and to change that, you need to do things differently. And so one needs to be able to evolve substantial R&D funding. If you say this, of course, in the Royal Society or in the research councils or in Victoria Street, they'll say, well, yeah, we kind of agree with you, but if we gave the money to those people in Manchester, they'd just waste it. So there is this sense that you need to kind of create analytical capacity and institutional capacity to be able to make good decisions. We do think there needs to be new R&D institutions, and I think for the reasons I've just been talking about, I think the place that we've been weak on is this translational research. So this leads us to the idea of innovation districts and manufacturing innovation parks as conscious attempts to build in this idea of an industrial commons in the way that ITRI produced the Tsin network. And I do think, I haven't actually talked very much about the institutions that, of course, get us into this place, but UKRI is our national funding agency. I think the way it works at the moment doesn't really help. I think there's a kind of institutional problem with representation of nations and regions, and I think we need explicit place-based funding instruments. We have one, the Strength in Places Fund, but it's still quite small. So what's going on? What's the government doing? So we've had a bit of a roller coaster of government policy, and I say the evolution of government policy for regional economic strategies if I'm going to talk about the long term. In fact, I'm going to start in 2015 because there's been quite enough change since then. So we have seen, I think, place rise in salience, and I do claim some credit for that. I think that our paper did make quite a bit of impact. Similarly, Onward, which is a think tank, a conservative-oriented think tank, very much associated with Neil O'Brien, so very much associated with the Levelling Up agenda. They also pointed this out in a report they produced last year. The UK Research and Development Roadmap in July 2020 talked about place in a way that hasn't happened in British science policy before, and that's encouraging. We've got a Levelling Up white paper coming soon. There's an R&D place advisory group to support that. That was on the point of producing a strategy in July, but Neil O'Brien kind of took that over and is incorporating that in the Levelling Up white paper. So we wait. In the next few weeks, we will find out what actually will come from this. The kind of wider context of this is industrial strategy. We had industrial strategy, of course, was a dirty word in British government for many decades, but in 2017 we had this, of course, was not this. People who remember the way it was introduced. This is a modern industrial strategy, so it wasn't one of those bad old 1970s industrial strategy. It was a modern industrial strategy. So that came out in 2017, but it clearly wasn't modern enough because it was thrown out by the Treasury in March this year. So in March this year, we saw the disbanding of the Industrial Strategy Council, which had been set up to monitor this industrial strategy that came out in 2017. And what this leaves is we had one of the products, I think one of the very good products of the 2017 industrial strategy was local industrial strategies. Greater Manchester was one of the first. We still have that. And you might ask the question, what's the status of that? And well, to anticipate where I'm going in a few minutes, the government might not like it, but I think we ought to keep on with it because it's quite a good document. What was in so what is the new economic strategy? Well, we have Build Back Better. It's got 3 pillars: infrastructure, skills, and innovation. And it's got 3 goals: to level up the UK. And that's defined in 2 ways: regenerating struggling towns and every region and nation to have at least one globally competitive city. And those two bullet points actually capture an important divergence. Support transition to net zero, so thought of very much in terms of new industries, and the mysterious slogan of Global Britain, which is a new export strategy. So the government has responded to this question of levelling up on R&D. As I say, the R&D roadmap explicitly said that we should do more to build on a wider range of R&D strengths. And the innovation strategy did say we need to ensure more places in the UK host world-leading and globally connected innovation clusters. So this is what actually this means we will find out in the Levelling Up white paper. We now have a Department of Levelling Up. So we saw on the 19th of September, MHCLG has been abolished and well, it's been rebranded as the new exciting Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Many people are asking, levelling up, is it just an empty slogan? I think actually, no, it's not. And I think the greatest source for this, I'm sure this is something you're all reading, but actually this interview about a week ago from the new minister, Michael Gove, actually I thought conveyed this in a very succinct and actually rather good way. It's about two things: making sure that someone can see a visible difference in somewhere being made more attractive and knows it's the focus of attention. The second thing is laying the groundwork for your long-term economic transformation. And I think that's where we've got to. Levelling Up has got two components. Part of it is about making people feel better about their place where they live right now. And then there's the long-term project of growing the economy. I want to mention that there's a false counterpoint at the moment about towns and cities that this bears on. So having just come from Oldham, I spent the day in Oldham with a bunch of local actors and Andy Westwood and Alan Francis as the principal of the FE College as the first meeting of the Oldham Economic Review. And, you know, one of the first things that one of the local government people said was, well, you know, the trouble is that, you know, Manchester has sucked all this money into central Manchester and, you know, Oldham has been completely neglected. And I think that's an understandable perspective, but I think it's wrong. And the reason I think it's wrong is that we've got these different challenges. Our second-tier cities in the UK do underperform. Manchester has done a great job of convincing everybody it's enormously successful, but it isn't. It's an underperforming city by European standards, and I think that's important. We do have the problem of towns and urban peripheries that have not yet recovered, you know, Oldham is a very fine example of that. And we also have problems of rural and coastal peripheries, particularly coastal towns. And these are distinct and different levelling up challenges. But I do stress the UK's large second-tier cities are not performing well enough to make their hinterlands prosperous. I think that's really important. And this plot from the Centre for Cities, I think, shows that really well. You know, we expect larger cities to produce agglomeration effects that make them more prosperous. We expect this a relationship, big cities being richer. We have this weird situation in the UK where some of the most prosperous places of the UK are not. It's not Manchester, it's not Birmingham, it's Slough, it's Swindon, it's Milton Keynes. So we've got Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, big cities that ought to be drivers of the economy that any other European country would be, that are massively underperforming. So I think that's a key problem that we have to solve. Okay, so finally, my last bit. What should we do in the regions? What should innovation do? And I'm going to talk specifically about Greater Manchester. Greater Manchester, of course, has its own levelling up problems. You know, this is a problem that is present on many different scales. Greater Manchester has a bunch of very poor, very underperforming outer parts. So Tameside, Oldham, Rochdale, Bolton to some extent are do very badly. It's got places that do a bit better. Trafford and Salford actually doing a little bit better than Manchester itself. But again, I stress that Greater Manchester as a whole is still operating at less than the average for the UK, and that is astonishing for a second city. That's just not how economic geography ought to work. I also want to say, levelling up, it's not just about money. We have productivity imbalances that translate into income imbalances, and they translate into other things like health outcomes. So we have profound regional inequalities in life expectancy, both across the UK. So Greater Manchester as a whole is much, you lose 5 or 10 years of life from moving from prosperous parts of the southeast to Greater Manchester, and then within Greater Manchester, moving from Tameside to Bury is going to take several years off your life. So this is really important, and it interacts with the economics very profoundly. People in poor places have bad health, and an unhealthy population is a drag on productivity. So I've just seen figures from Oldham about the number of long-term people not participating in the labour market because of long-term sickness. It's very high, and that has to be a drag on the economic performance. So I think public health and regional economic development do need to go together. So what did we do in Greater Manchester? So Greater Manchester, this was announced sometime earlier this year. The idea of Innovation Greater Manchester as an organisation would be, if you like, that organisation that if the government wanted to devolve R&D money to, we want to create an organisation that would be able to receive that and make good decisions about how to translate any spending into economic benefit. And essentially, our idea is that we would want to partner with the government in an innovation deal with this new organisation, Innovation GM. It needs to be a public-private partnership, so it's led by the private sector. So our chair is Chris Oglesby of Bruntwood. It should be very closely connected to the combined authority, which it is. It needs to be strongly endorsed by the political leadership, and Andy Burnham was doing a great job, very much on message earlier this week, going around the Conservative Party conference. He's involved the existing knowledge producing institutions, so all 5 GM universities, and we've seen a week or two ago a GM-wide Civic university agreement, and increasingly the FE colleges. So, as I say, having spent the day in an FE college in Oldham, that's even more pressing for me than it was before. I'm the scientific advisor to it, and our idea is that we want to produce kind of rigorously tested investment propositions that really would drive productivity across the whole of GM. And this comes back to this point about different levels of geographies. It needs to be outward looking, not just about GM. It needs to look out to Cheshire, to West Yorkshire, to Lancashire, and indeed across the whole country. And it needs to take into account all 2.8 million people. So again, I think of this in 3 ways. I think we need city centre innovation districts that are based around, the research university, the assets of a research university. So that's the motivation for ID Manchester, about. I think we need manufacturing innovation parks, institutions for innovation diffusion that explicitly rebuild this idea of an industrial commons. And so I think Rochdale's just received funding for an advanced machinery and productivity institute involving National Physical Laboratory. So I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to do. The question, again, absolutely fresh in my mind coming from Oldham, what do you do in the town centre of Oldham or Bolton or Bury? That I still don't know the answer to. So I'm going to finish just by saying loads of stuff that I don't know, and I think real outstanding questions. I think we're in this time, we're trying to kind of influence policy on the basis of the best knowledge that we have. I still think, I think there's still quite a lot of knowledge gaps. I think, we don't know enough about the geography of R&D. I think, the questions, outstanding questions of government policy are, will they actually produce one that's coherent and properly funded? We will see. What's the best way for cities and regions to respond? We've produced a blueprint. Other places are doing their best. I think Northern Ireland, I think, has got a very impressive innovation strategy, seeing efforts from the Southwest and from the West Midlands that are more or less in the same direction. So that's where we are. I'm going to just stop there and say thank you very much, and hope some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for a wonderful talk. It raised many interesting issues for me, certainly, and I'm sure for many others in the audience here in the room, but also online. I think the leveling up agenda is very difficult to escape. I mean, everybody's talking about it. And we all hope there's no anti-rhetoric. And I think you did a great job in talking about the challenges, but also some concrete areas where we can start kind of to articulate policy ways forward. So I think, oh wow, already a lot of few hands. So I remind the people online to pose the questions. We'll be collecting them. So we'll start with the question.
Hello, Brendan Doyle. I'm the CEO of CMSPI and CMS. So I've got two payments businesses. Both of them were started up. One was started up in Warrington, and one was started up in Runcorn, so the Daresbury Science Park. I had to move both of them into Manchester because I couldn't get the quality of people. And that's just 20 minutes away. So when you talk about the cities versus the towns, I mean, I'd hate to be an entrepreneur in Cumbria. It'd be very difficult to attract the talent that you need. And there's just quickly the second point on R&D tax credits. And I invest an awful lot in R&D. I get tax credits. I don't really know why. I don't need them. And I also know lots of businesses who get them. One particular industry whereby there's three companies competing. None of them make any money. None of them ever will make any money. And all of them kept going by R&D tax credits. It's a disastrous policy.
Right. No, thank you. And I mean, I think the point about skills is really crucial. And I think it's one of the kind of, I mean, I do believe it's actually a huge failing of our current system is that, skills policy is kept separate from innovation policy. I think, it's 200 yards from Bayes, the Department for Education, but it might as well be a million miles for all they talk to each other. And I think that's a real failing. And I think, it's one of the things I hope we can do locally in a city is to connect innovation and our innovation policy and our skills policy much more closely, so we can get the skills at all levels that innovative businesses need now, but even more, what are the skills that people are going to need for the more a more productive economy that we aspire to. So I think that's a crucial point. And thanks for your comments on R&D tax credits. I'm trying to be more or less agnostic about it, but I do have sympathy with David Connell's views. There's a lot of dead weight in that spending. You reinforce that suspicion.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about that. I was quite shocked as well by the figures. I was wondering what are your thoughts on whether we're using the kind of policy levers that we have in an intelligent way, and we have an interest here in the Institute of Innovation Research on public demand and the role of public procurement. And so are there other tools in the policy mix that we could be using in a better way?
Well, no, I think it's a great question. R&D tax credits are a fantastic HM Treasury instrument because they don't have to make any decisions. They don't have to worry about understanding sectors or understanding needs. It's just an automatic thing that they could just, the claim comes in, they write the check, the money goes out. So it's it's very much in tune with the mindset of Treasury. But on the other hand, I think it does have the danger of great deadweight. It has the danger of outright fraud, really. Lots of I think that jump in the R&D tax credit does suggest that there's a lot of desperate reclassification of activities that are probably just kind of standard marketing activities as R&D. So I think the other side of the coin, I will say, just to be balanced about this, it's clear that for many startup companies, in that kind of pre-revenue phase, R&D tax credits can be a part of their, an important part of their business plan. And if they do actually get to the stage of producing products and getting those revenues in, maybe that's, that's a positive side. And the procurement side, I mean, interestingly, David Connell, whose paper that was, who's very skeptical about R&D tax credits, he's actually been very forceful about a forceful advocate of procurement and contracts, things like Small Business Research Initiative is something that he's been strongly associated with. So, and those are things that can be much more closely targeted. They can be much more directed towards government priorities. That, of course, means that the government actually has to have some priorities. So that's the downside.
That's the first one, isn't it? Gerald has a question. Yeah.
Hi Richard, Gerald Hodgkinson, Vice Dean for Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Professor of Strategic Management and Behavioural Science. Thanks, that was a really fascinating analysis, very nuanced and really underscores just how we've been like a zombie economy in many ways, just low skill, low wage, lack of innovation. The big worry I've got, I suppose, is how quickly we can close the skills gap as we move to a much more regionally nuanced build back. And I'd welcome your thoughts on that. And I grew up, by the way, in North Manchester, probably a mile from where the new facility is going to be in Rochdale, in Hayward. And my father was a shuttle maker, so I do know about textiles as well. And I think there's a massive challenge in terms of absorptive capacity to actually create the workforce that we need. So I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think it is a big challenge. And I think it's a challenge, again, I think it's something that challenges the Treasury view. And I am going to blame the Treasury here because it is their view. If you talk to, there's a bunch of policymakers that if you talk to, they say the problem with a place like Rochdale or a place like Barnsley or a place like Dudley is that there are, the skills aren't there. And that's true, and the statistics show that you have high levels of adults with no skills at all. There's no question that's true. But I think it's wrong to think of it as a supply problem. I think it's a demand problem. I think if places had innovative businesses that were looking for people, then people would put the effort in to get those skills. So again, this comes back to why I think skills agenda and the innovation agenda have to go together much more than they have. And I very much welcome the fact that AMPI in Rochdale, it set out right at the outset to work with Hopwood Hall, its local FE college, and indeed, its partner universities to work out how to develop those skills. So I think I completely agree with the thrust of your question. Am I as pessimistic as you? I don't know. I mean, you just have to try.
I think we can take some questions. I think we can take some questions.
Yeah, we have lots of questions coming online, which is great. I'll just pair two together, actually, Richard, for you. One was, why is Greater Manchester not performing as well as it should? Further to your point before. And secondly, and probably related, how urgent is it that we address health inequalities to close the productivity gap between North and South?
Yes, I'm not sure. I don't think I have a good answer for why Greater Manchester is underperforming. I think it probably, it does go back to the historical, to that deindustrialisation, the way that its former strengths have fallen away in areas like chemicals, electronics that have been, that in the post-war period were very strong in Manchester. One can talk about the general reasons for why those industries didn't survive in Manchester as in the rest of the UK, where they did in other countries. So those are kind of difficult questions of political economy. I have a few views on, but I'm not sure I can say they're completely evidence-based. And then, sorry, what was the other question?
Yeah, how urgent is it that we address the health inequalities to close the productivity gap between North and South?
I think the health, I think those, it is urgent. I think it's urgent on two levels. I think, frankly, as a citizen, as it were, I think it's just unacceptable that you have these kind of 5 or 10-year differences in life expectancy according to where you live. So I think, you know, there's a moral reason why they're unacceptable, but then there's the economic reason too. And I think, you know, it's a very significant part of the economic underperformance of those places that you have such a reservoir of unhealthy people. I mean, it's quite a long-standing problem, of course, so it's, you know, it's not something that's cropped up recently.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions in the room. I think Bart, okay, yeah, later there, Bart.
Hi, I'm Max Bradbury. I'm brand new to the university, so still learning a lot, but really interested to have your opinion on social mobility. Could be really interested to see, we know in the UK, social mobility is stalled at best and got worse in some cases. What's your views on kind of how we make sure leveling up doesn't increase that gap, but actually kind of reduces it and makes it leveling up for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that surprises many people, I think, is, you know, particularly, you know, if I can be crude and stereotypical, the members of my audience. Now, I expect all of us have moved, you know, we've moved countries, we've moved jobs, we've happily gone from one place to the other. I think many people, people like us, if I can put it that way, who've done that, probably are surprised by how many people do not want to move very far from where they grew up. And, you know, I don't think one should say that that's a wrong position to have. So having a geographically unequal country necessarily means that that you reduce social mobility, because all those people who don't want to move, you know, they want to look after, they want to be close to their family, they want to look after their family, that you know, they've got networks that we don't want to disrupt. If you're condemning those people to a kind of second-class economic outcome because the place that they live is economically underperforming, that's, I think, wrong and undesirable. So I think, and I kind of agree with Michael Gove on that, actually. There you are. That's, you know, his definition of levelling up was cast in that way, that people's life chances shouldn't depend on whether they, you know, they shouldn't need to move in order to have a fulfilling life. And I think I probably do agree with that.
Bart van Ark, Productivity Institute. Well, thanks, Richard. As always, lots of thought-provoking comments. I think I want to ask you a question on your last 3 questions, and it's just one question, which is the relationship between public and private R&D at local level. Because you're praising the virtues of public R&D. It's open, it's non-rival, non-exclusive, as we economists call it. And that's all fantastic. And I do believe, I think you're right, although there's issues around the causality, but probably public-private is crowding in private R&D. But once it gets private R&D, you get a lot of non-rival and non-exclusive effects. It becomes more competitive. And I think a real issue that we have in many localities is that, yes, we do have R&D, but the openness and the diffusion of it is disappearing. And what is it that we want governments and in places and the localities and councils to do to sort of retain that sort of openness of new technologies and R&D and have more companies benefit from it? We're ending up with too many places where there's one company that's very good in doing R&D, but too few companies around it are really benefiting from it. So what is it in these local policies that you want to get done in order to keep those spillovers, as we call them, from public R&D?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and you know, I really would like to understand what is known rigorously and what is yet to be known rigorously in this. I mean, my intuition is that, you know, one of the major channels for spillovers is people moving. It's people moving jobs. It's people, you know, being trained in one company going somewhere else. You know, I think, you know, there's some very interesting, I know there is some interesting literature from the USA, and, you know, the effect of non-compete agreements on spillovers in places where non-compete agreements are outlawed. You know, I think there is real evidence that that does lead to more of this diffusion. So I think, you know, you know, perhaps way to think about this. It is part of, the kind of competition law and, outlawing anti-competitive practices that are linked to that diffusion.
Okay. Take another question from Fiona, and then we'll move again to questions online.
Thank you. So, Richard, also thank you very much for a really interesting talk. So you put the one slide up which interested me, where you talked about how places like Manchester and Birmingham are not performing as we might imagine, but it's places like Luton, Slough and Milton Keynes that might be. Now, I'm somebody where Luton is a special place in my heart because I did my PhD there. And it's a place where I know that, of course, it had the Vauxhall car company, which employed 33,000 people in 1962. And there were such skill shortages that they would pay current employees £5 for every other employee that they could get in the company. And if there's 3,000 people there now in the van factory in Dunstable, that will probably be an overestimate of the number of people employed. So it was making me think, what places like this, what's working there now? That's a place that's also gone through incredible transformations. Are they all places that just happen to be close to London, or is there something else that's happening in those places?
Yeah, that's a great question. Frankly, I'm surprised that Luton's doing so well. As someone who used to live in that part of the world, it never seemed to me that, probably say the same about Slough. I just don't know, actually. I know Ron Martin's written some interesting things about the differing trajectories of those kind of medium-sized southern cities versus big northern and Midland conurbations. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I know what the answer is. It seems odd.
Just wondering, in terms of looking at what works, in terms of how.
Well, I think it does bear on this question of towns versus cities, and the complaint that Sheffield has done down Barnsley for the last 400 years, which I've got used to. The fact is that part of the success of London as a driver of that economy is measured by the fact that its satellite towns and small cities actually have done very well. And is that just because London's a fantastically successful city? And if Manchester was as successful or Sheffield was as successful, it would spill out to Barnsley and Oldham. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have time to take a few questions online? Yeah?
This is a question from one of the colleagues here, Professor Bruce Tever. He talks about the innovation figures you quoted. He says the real shocker from the UK Innovation Survey is the low rate of process innovation. He asks, how do so many firms get away with so little innovation activity?
Well, yeah, I mean, this comes back to the question of that distribution of. I talk about it, but there's been a lot of discussion about the long tail, dispersion of productivity within companies. Yes, it seems that many companies are both. Well, they seem to manage, despite in a sense that they're not taking those opportunities that they could be more successful. So this comes to the problem of how do you do innovation diffusion? How do you convey the possibilities of new technologies to companies that possibly quite possibly maybe they would like to grow but they don't know how to, or maybe they're not even very ambitious and they've got a niche and they're happy to stay in that niche. These are difficult questions.
Just ask one more, sorry, conscious of time and also audience. Another question was, where do rural areas fit into the levelling up agenda?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I think it's I think that those problems are very different, and I think the problem of even within different rural areas have different problems. So the problem of rural Lincolnshire is a different place to Blackpool, and that's a different place to Pembrokeshire. I think in some places that there are opportunities. I mean, Lincolnshire is quite interesting because I think one of the great institutional success stories in the UK of the last few decades is the University of Lincoln, which arrived as a relatively new institution, focused on some areas that I think are quite important for its region, agri-tech and such like, as well as engineering, the involvement of Siemens as an employer. And they have done that thing, I think, of upping skills and growing innovation at the same point. So I mean, there are examples. I expect you'll probably find other examples elsewhere, but it does. And I think the same is true everywhere. You have to kind of. There is no single solution for places. The solution involves understanding what the existing what the existing economic base is and how one can work with the grain to develop that further.
I think we might have run out of time. I don't know. Do we have time for the question? I know also there are 2 questions in the room. So I take the final 2 questions in the room. Yeah, I think Sylvia had a question and then Kieran has a question.
Yeah.
But then the 2 together and then
Okay.
we'll wrap up.
Hi, Silvia Massini. I'm professor of economics and management of innovation here in the business school. And I've been studying skills and innovation for quite some time. And my latest research is looking at, where we don't have answers yet, but we're looking at digital skills for innovation and eventually productivity. But it looks like there are issues about mainstream skills here, skills deficiencies at the basic level. So also the figures that you showed earlier about from the innovation survey, the UK innovation survey, really showed that the training by companies is the smallest amount. So my question is, what skills are we talking about? Who should pay for this? Maybe instead of R&D subsidies, we could have a skill training incentives or subsidies. And which skills do you think would benefit Greater Manchester?
And then Kieran, quick question. And then we can answer. Yeah.
Okay, I've got this one. I was going to ask about because you hinted at it, but you were very diplomatic. I was going to ask about the of policy and perhaps also scientific community that's led to that extreme concentration of public R&D. But I'm not going to ask that. Instead, I'm going to ask: will HS2 mean that Birmingham becomes Slough?
Yeah. Okay. On the skills front, what skills does Greater Manchester need? And I think, I mean, the comment I would make there is that I think, there's been a long tradition in UK policy of saying, the only people who know what the skills requirements are employers. And I don't think that's wholly tenable. I think employers know some of the skills requirements, but they don't know what skills they don't know they need. And I think understanding how to fill in that gap is really important. I mean, I was very struck, talking to, Made Smarter is actually kind of, been quite a very interesting initiative, which started out, I think, with the aspiration of going to companies and saying, helping them introduce industrial digitalization, industry 4.0, AI, lots of very high-flown skills. And I think, I think it's not unfair to say, in many cases, what they found was, oh my God, who sold you that database? And much lower level. It's still important, but lower level digital skills are the ones that we're missing. So I think we need to slightly rebalance that so that clearly employers are very important for understanding the skills needs, but that needs to be supplemented by helping employers understand what skills they don't know they need, but they probably do, And I don't really know how to do that. And it's excellent when you good to hear about that. Yeah, HS2. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, Birmingham's not that far away from London anyway. I mean, it's you know, why is it not Slough already?
So that's a really interesting way of putting it. I guess the point of the question was, does Birmingham have a destiny as a second city R&D intensive in the context of a very, very short-term plan for London, or does it become more like a place like that?
Well, I think, you know, Birmingham, you know, the West Midlands as a whole is quite an R&D intensive part of the country, albeit mostly private sector. And it has some sectors that are, you know, very distinct from London that have high productivity growth. So, you know, its auto sector has been quite successful, really quite strikingly successful. So I think, yeah, I guess so the answer, I think, is, will it benefit from some minutes shaved off the travel time? I don't know. Does it have a kind of separate economic destiny? Yeah, I think it does. So I can't see a world in which Birmingham is entirely a satellite of London.
Okay, so those are all. That's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very much, Richard, for your insights and for answering so many questions, and thank you for the very good points raised that help us to understand the link between innovation and leveling up and of productivity and economic development. I'm going to pass it on to Fiona for some wrapping up comments.
Yeah, so thank you, Elvira. Thank you, Richard, very much for that lecture. And I would be very fair to say that you've really got us all thinking about a wide range of issues, huge empirical amount of information that you supplied us with, and lots of thoughts about policy interventions and thinking about how to improve the situation and where to start with some very large intractable problems that are quite long duration. Thank you to everybody in the audience here face to face for the questions, but also the opportunity to have questions come through from the online audience. Really pleased to have that as well. And I think it goes up in the chat function online, maybe even goes above us here on the screen, I'm not sure, but we have plenty of events coming forward, both vital topics, but also our original thinking webinars. So do join us again in the not too distant future for both online and face-to-face events. And thank you very much again, Richard. Thank you, Elvira.